In a world of deceit and power, Emma, a humble housekeeper, discovers a hidden web of corruption within the prestigious Grand Belmont Hotel. As she uncovers shocking truths, she's forced to face those who would stop at nothing to protect their empire. With courage, integrity, and a burning desire for justice, Emma fights to reclaim the hotel and her life, while learning that even the darkest secrets can be brought to light. Will she triumph or fall to the shadows? Where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more incredible stories. Emma Carter had always dreamed of working at the Grand Belmont Hotel, one of New York's finest establishments. But despite her optimism, her first week there proved to be a harsh awakening. The polished lobby, the perfectly manicured gardens, the guests clad in luxurious attire. It was all so breathtaking. But Emma quickly realized that the glittering facade masked a much darker reality. As a housekeeper, she was often at the bottom of the food chain, tasked with cleaning up after the wealthy and the influential, her efforts barely recognized. The first person she met on her shift, however, was not an arrogant guest or a demanding manager. It was an old man who shuffled into the hotel, looking more like he belonged on the streets than in the grand halls of the Grand Belmont. His clothes were worn and filthy, his hair unkempt. Emma couldn't help but notice him as he slumped into a seat in the lobby, looking lost and out of place. She approached him hesitantly, wondering if he needed help. "Excuse me, sir," Emma said gently. "Can I help you with something?" The old man looked up, startled but grateful. His voice was soft but filled with gratitude as he explained that he had come to apply for a job as a janitor. Emma was taken aback. How could someone like him get hired here? She was used to seeing the pristine image of the hotel's employees, and this man seemed so out of place. Yet, there was something in his eyes, a quiet dignity perhaps, or the weight of years that made her pause. Without hesitation, she offered him the sandwich she had packed for lunch, knowing she wouldn't be able to finish it herself. "Please take this." "You look like you could use a meal," Emma said, placing the sandwich in front of him. "Thank you, miss. You're very kind. I haven't eaten all day," he replied with a soft smile. Emma smiled back, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right about the situation. She learned that the old man's name was Richard Hamilton, and while he seemed unremarkable at first glance, there was an aura about him that made her curious. He was polite, soft-spoken, and grateful. But that was all she knew about him before he left the lobby, promising to return the next day with his resume. The next morning, as Emma cleaned the hallway, she saw Richard again. This time, he had managed to clean himself up a little, his clothes slightly less shabby. But he still looked out of place among the well-dressed hotel staff. Emma offered to help him with the application process, taking him straight to here. Grateful for her kindness, the receptionist at the front desk gave Emma a puzzled look as she guided the old man through the halls. Why would a man like that even try to work here? The receptionist must have been thinking, just as she had, but Emma didn't judge. Everyone deserved kindness, no matter their appearance. Little did Emma know Richard wasn't just any elderly man. He wasn't just a down-on his luck applicant desperate for work. He was, in fact, the owner of the Grand Belmont Hotel. Richard Hamilton, under the guise of an elderly janitor, had come to see for himself how his hotel was being run. He had suspected that things weren't as they seemed in his prized establishment, and the staff's treatment of him confirmed it. Over the course of several weeks, Richard observed the employees, particularly the higher-ups, who mistreated their subordinates, bullied others, and allowed corruption to fester in the hotel. As Emma continued her work, she noticed that the more glamorous staff, like the arrogant floor manager Greg Turner and his scheming assistant Madeline, treated Richard like an invisible man. They mocked him behind his back, and Emma could sense their disdain, especially when they saw her interacting with him. But Emma remained unshaken. She had never been one to judge others based on their looks, and she refused to let their cruel behavior affect her. Emma's kindness toward Richard was the only light in an otherwise cold, corrupt world. And, as the days passed, Richard grew more impressed with her. He noticed how, despite being constantly belittled, Emma carried herself with grace and dignity. Unlike the others, who sought power and wealth, Emma worked tirelessly, genuinely caring for the guests and the hotel's success. He admired her more with each passing day. But Richard knew that Emma's kindness would be tested soon enough. The undercurrents of deceit and corruption in the hotel would soon come to a head, and Emma would find herself in the middle of a storm she could never have anticipated. As he walked silently through the hotel, observing the staff, Richard made a decision, one that would change Emma's life forever. Emma's day started like any other, a rush to catch a cab before the morning madness of traffic took over. She had been working at the Grand Belmont for 3 months now, but the same problems persisted. Long hours demanding managers, and a never-ending list of tasks. She had barely managed to make it through the morning without being scolded for something minor, like leaving a guest room slightly out of order. Today, however, things were worse than usual. The subway lines were packed, and the traffic was a mess. As the minutes ticked by and Emma sat in the back of a taxi, frustration started to build. The cab was crawling through the gridlock of the city, and she knew that if she didn't get to the hotel soon, she'd face more than just a reprimand. Her job might be on the line. She glanced at the driver through the rearview mirror, who seemed to be distracted by the occasional glance in her direction. Her discomfort was palpable, but there was nothing she could do. Every cab she passed was taken, and to hop out now would mean risking even higher fares with no guarantee of getting to work on time. The driver, seemingly annoyed by the slow pace of traffic, muttered under his breath. Emma tried to ignore him, sinking into her seat and pulling out her phone to distract herself. She played random videos on her screen, anything to take her mind off the growing anxiety she was feeling. The minutes dragged by, and soon almost half an hour had passed, and they hadn't moved more than a few blocks. Frustrated and close to tears, Emma threw open the car door before it even fully stopped, leaving a few bills for the fare. "I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore," she muttered, more to herself than the driver. The heat of the pavement hit her as soon as she stepped outside, but she didn't hesitate. She grabbed her high heels, tucking them under her arm as she sprinted down the sidewalk, ignoring the hot pavement beneath her feet. As she ran, she muttered under her breath about the unfairness of it all. The taxi had been her last hope for making it on time, and now she was stuck walking through the streets of the city, late and exhausted. She pushed past pedestrians, feeling the sweat already starting to form on her brow. Just when she thought it couldn't get any worse, she found herself in another stretch of road, where traffic seemed to have cleared up, but there was no available cab in sight. The only thing she could do was keep running. Her legs were aching and her heels were starting to feel like bricks in her hands. "Great. Just great," she muttered. She had no choice but to keep going. Her job was too important. She had to get to work. But as she rounded the corner, she heard a car slowing down beside her. The window rolled down, revealing a face she recognized. Ethan Blake, the head manager of the hotel. Emma stopped in her tracks, staring up at him. Ethan was strikingly handsome, almost movie star material. But it wasn't just his looks that made him stand out. He was the kind of boss who didn't treat his employees as though they were beneath him. He was the only one at the Grand Belmont who seemed to see her as more than just another worker bee. "Hey, what's going on? Need a ride?" Ethan asked, his voice warm and friendly. Emma hesitated, looking at him with a mix of relief and embarrassment. "Oh, I don't know. I don't want to be a bother." "Don't worry about it," Ethan interrupted with a smile. "It's clear you're in a rush. I'm headed that way anyway." Come on, hop in." Emma didn't even have time to protest before she found herself climbing into the passenger seat of his sleek black car. The moment she settled into the leather seats, she could breathe a little easier. The city streets whizzed by as Ethan turned on the radio, keeping the conversation light. "I've been stuck in traffic for over an hour myself," he said with a grin, easing the tension Emma hadn't even realized was building up. "You'd think they'd get these streets figured out by now, huh?" Emma laughed, her nerves beginning to settle. "Yeah, it's a mess out there today. I thought I was going to be late for sure." "You're not late yet," Ethan assured her, his gaze flickering briefly to her before turning back to the road. "I'll talk to the managers when we get there. Don't worry about it." Emma, still grateful for the ride, smiled weakly. "Thank you. I don't want them thinking I don't take my job seriously." "Relax," he replied. "I'll handle it." "You've always been one of the most reliable people at the hotel." As the car sped toward the Grand Belmont, Emma couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm. Ethan was the one manager who treated her like a person and not just an employee. It wasn't lost on her that he'd gone out of his way. It wasn't lost on her that he'd gone out of his way to make her feel comfortable. It was the little things like this that made the long hours bearable, especially in an environment that was far more cutthroat than she had anticipated. When they reached the hotel, Emma expected him to drop her off and head off to his own duties. But to her surprise, Ethan followed her inside. His presence was like a shield, his demeanor so different from the others that she immediately felt at ease. But as they walked through the lobby, she couldn't help but notice the eyes of the other employees following them. Whispers spread like wildfire, but Ethan remained unbothered, his warm smile never faltering. As they made their way to the staff room, Emma found herself caught off guard when she saw the familiar face of Jim, the floor manager who had been nothing but trouble since her first day. He eyed her with a look of disdain before offering sarcastic greeting. "You made it on time after all, huh?" Jim said, his voice dripping with mockery. Ethan, however, didn't flinch. "I had Emma help me out with some errands earlier. I told her to come in late, so we'll just say that was why she was delayed. No big deal." Jim, who typically ran the hotel floor with an iron fist, seemed to back off immediately. The power dynamics were clear. Ethan had the authority, and Jim could only protest so much. As Emma walked past, she could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, some curious, others judgmental. But for once, she didn't care. Today, Ethan had given her more than a ride. He had given her more than a ride. He had given her a sense of security in a world that often felt indifferent to her. She smiled to herself, grateful that, for once, someone saw her as more than just another worker in the system. The days that followed were tense, as Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right at the Grand Belmont Hotel. Her nerves were shot, but she refused to let the stress show. She had made it through so many rough shifts already, but now things felt different. It wasn't just the usual tiredness from working long hours. No, this time, the air felt thick with something far more dangerous. She started to notice small things, tiny inconsistencies, suspicious behaviors from some of the staff, particularly Greg Turner, the floor manager, and Madeline, his ambitious assistant. It was late one evening when Emma first caught a glimpse of something truly troubling. She had been assigned to clean the hotel's upper floors, a routine task she had done hundreds of times before. But this time, she had a strange sense that someone was watching her. As she passed by room 723, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. It wasn't unusual for the guests to leave their rooms open for a moment, but there was something about the way the door was left that made Emma's heart race. Quietly, she peeked inside. What she saw sent a chill down her spine. Greg and Madeline were in the room with two other unfamiliar faces, all of them whispering furtively. On the bed were scattered bundles of cash, and there were laptops open, displaying what looked like video feeds from various hotel rooms. Emma's stomach churned as she quickly realized what was going on. The hotel was being used for more than just business meetings and luxurious stays. These were illegal activities. The sight of it was enough to make Emma's knees weaken, but she forced herself to back away quietly, slipping out of sight before anyone noticed her. Her heart raced as she continued her rounds, trying to shake the image from her mind. The next few days passed in a blur, but Emma couldn't get the thought out of her head. She tried to tell herself it wasn't her problem, that maybe she had misinterpreted what she saw. But deep down, she knew better. Something was going on behind the polished, glamorous exterior of the Grand Belmont, and it was dark, dangerous, and it was starting to involve her. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Emma found herself in the staff break room, trying to collect her thoughts. She wasn't hungry, but she absent-mindedly picked at her lunch as she listened to the low murmur of conversation around her. Madeline and some of the other junior staff were talking, but it was the topic that caught Emma's attention. Money. Lots of money. Madeline spoke about it in hushed tones, a conversation clearly meant to remain private. But when the words cash from room 723 were mentioned, Emma felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to know what was really going on. But before she could act on her thoughts, the door to the break room opened, and Jim, the head of security, walked in. His eyes scanned the room briefly before settling on her. Emma felt a twinge of unease at the way he looked at her, but she quickly composed herself. "Got a minute?" Jim asked, his voice low. "There's something we need to talk about." Emma's stomach sank. She knew exactly what this was about. The missing wallet. The accusations that had already started to circle. She followed Jim down the hall, past the manager's office, and toward the staff elevator. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her the entire time, and for a moment it felt like he was toying with her. She had no idea where this was leading, but the tension was unbearable. When they reached the elevator, Jim's smile was thin, barely there, but his eyes were cold. "Don't worry, Emma. We'll get to the bottom of this. You've been a good employee. But some things are about to change." A chill ran through Emma as the elevator doors slid shut. The ride to the top floor was excruciatingly slow. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was being led into a trap. Her mind raced as she thought about what she had seen and heard in room 723. The illegal activities, the money, the videos. If Jim knew what she suspected, she was about to find herself in deep trouble. The elevator dinged and the doors slid open. To her surprise, however, they didn't head down the usual hallways. Instead, Jim led her to the back office, a place she had never been before. It was dimly lit, and the air smelled of stale coffee and expensive cigars. Inside, a large desk sat in the center of the room, surrounded by a few chairs and shelves filled with files and security equipment. "You know, Emma," Jim said, his voice now smoother, almost too calm. "I've been watching you. You're good at what you do. But I think you've been getting a little too close to the wrong people." Before she could respond, the door swung open and Madeline stepped in, followed by Greg. They wore identical smirks, as if everything was going according to plan. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't a conversation about her job anymore. This was something far worse. Greg stepped forward, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You've been quite the distraction, Emma. You're in over your head now, and it's too late to back out." Emma's breath caught in her throat. Her mind flashed to Richard, the old man she had helped, the one person who'd been kind to her when everyone else treated her like nothing. She didn't know what had happened to him. But now she realized it wasn't just her job at risk. They were going to take everything from her, and she had to find a way out. Just as she was about to speak, a voice interrupted the moment. Enough. The voice was calm, but authoritative, and it made everyone freeze. Emma turned to see none other than Ethan Blake, the head manager, standing in the doorway, his face stern, his presence commanding. The smug smiles on Greg and Madeline's faces immediately faltered. Ethan stepped inside, his eyes cold as ice. "I've been watching you too," Ethan said, locking eyes with Greg. "And you're done." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing. It was about to get much more dangerous. The next few days were filled with a strange unease. Emma couldn't shake the images of what she had witnessed, nor the nagging feeling that she was being watched. At first, she convinced herself it was just paranoia, that she was imagining things, overthinking the whole situation. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more obvious it became that something was wrong. Something dark was festering within the walls of the Grand Belmont Hotel, and Emma was tangled up in it, whether she wanted to be or not. One evening, after a particularly brutal shift, Emma was heading to the staff room when she noticed something that made her stop in her tracks. As she walked down the hallway, she caught sight of a few of the hotel's security staff. Jim, the head of security, and a few others, standing near the elevator, speaking in hushed tones. Their body language was tense, their conversation filled with urgency. At first, Emma tried to pass by without being noticed, but then she saw Greg and Madeline slip into the elevator with a large bag that looked far too bulky for any of the hotel's usual equipment. Her pulse quickened. She knew she shouldn't, but she couldn't resist the urge to follow. She kept her distance, careful not to make a sound as the elevator descended slowly toward the lower floors. She was aware of every footstep, every breath she took, terrified that one of them would turn around and see her. As the elevator doors opened, Greg and Madeline stepped out, their eyes darting nervously around as they hurried down a secluded hallway. Emma's heart raced, and before she could stop herself, she followed them at a safe distance. They stopped at room 702, a rarely used suite, and Emma's breath caught in her throat when she saw the key card Greg used to unlock the door. It was a restricted floor, one the staff was strictly forbidden to enter unless specifically authorized. The two of them went inside, and Emma's curiosity overwhelmed her. She didn't know what was happening, but she had to find out. She waited a few moments, then crept up to the door. She tried to peek through the small crack in the doorway, but the door was closing fast. Panicking, she quietly pushed it open just enough to slip inside without being seen. What she witnessed was a chilling sight. Inside the room, the lights were dim, casting long shadows on the walls. There, in the center of the room, were several men, all in dark suits. They were speaking in low voices, but Emma could make out the occasional words: bribes, guests, laundering. Her heart hammered in her chest as she realized what she was looking at: a criminal operation running inside the very hotel she worked for. There were more bags of cash on the floor, more illegal activities being coordinated in plain sight. She froze in place, knowing she had just stumbled upon something far more dangerous than she could have imagined. Before she could back out of the room, Greg's voice cut through the air. "We're on a tight schedule. We can't afford to make mistakes. The higher-ups are watching us closely." Emma's stomach turned. She had never been this close to something so sinister. But she knew she couldn't just walk away. If she did, she might be implicated in whatever was going on. There was only one thing she could do: get proof. Slowly, carefully, she pulled out her phone, her hands shaking as she snapped a few photos. The light from her phone's screen felt like a spotlight in the dark room, but no one seemed to notice. Just as she was about to turn and leave, the door swung open, and Jim stepped inside, his eyes immediately locking onto her. For a moment, Emma thought her heart might stop. She froze, unable to think of a lie fast enough. But instead of reacting with anger, Jim smiled, a thin, almost predatory smile. "Emma," he said coolly, his voice low and steady. "What? I didn't think you'd be here." Before she could say anything, he moved swiftly toward her, blocking the exit. "You should have stayed away, Emma. You've seen too much now." The panic that flooded Emma's chest was palpable. She could feel the walls closing in, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She tried to back away, but Jim reached out and grabbed her arm. His grip like iron. "It's too late to run now. You know too much. You're not going anywhere." Her mind raced. This was it. She was caught. She had nothing to defend herself with, no way to get out of this situation. But just as Jim's grip tightened, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Someone was coming. Without thinking, Emma twisted in his grasp, using every ounce of strength to break free. She shoved him hard, stumbling backward toward the door. Then, to her shock, the door swung open once more, and Ethan Blake appeared in the doorway, his presence commanding and authoritative. "Enough," Ethan said firmly, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Let her go, Jim." For a split second, everything seemed to freeze. Jim's expression faltered, confusion and rage battling for control over his features. "What's going on here, Ethan?" Jim spat, his voice laced with venom. Ethan's calm response was laced with an edge that sent a wave of relief through Emma. "You're done, Jim. You've been caught." Without another word, Ethan stepped forward, signaling for the security team to move in. Emma's heart pounded as the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Ethan had known. He had known all along what was happening in the hotel, and he had been waiting for the right moment to act. As the security team moved to detain Greg and Madeline, Emma stood there, her knees trembling, but her heart soaring with relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, she realized that she wasn't alone. Ethan had been watching over her, and now the truth was coming out. The game had changed, and Emma was about to find out just how deep the corruption went. Emma's heart raced as the truth began to unfold before her eyes. The moment Ethan stepped into that room, everything changed. She had no idea how he had managed to stay one step ahead, but there was no mistaking it. The web of corruption at the Grand Belmont Hotel was being unraveled right before her. For a moment, she stood frozen, watching as Greg, Madeline, and Jim were handcuffed and taken away by security. The tension in the air was palpable, and Emma's mind was spinning, unable to fully grasp the enormity of what had just happened. Ethan gave her a reassuring look, his eyes calm yet resolute. "You're safe now, Emma," he said, his voice low and steady. "This has gone on long enough." As Greg and Madeline were escorted out of the building, Emma's legs nearly buckled beneath her. She hadn't realized just how much fear she'd been carrying around until that moment. The hotel that had once felt like a gilded cage, filled with false smiles and whispered secrets, suddenly felt different. The weight of the truth was lifting, and with it, Emma felt a surge of hope she hadn't known she still had in her. Ethan walked up to her, his presence still commanding, but now there was a softness to his demeanor. "You did the right thing, Emma," he said, offering her a small but genuine smile. "You didn't back down even when things seemed impossible." Emma nodded, her voice catching in her throat. "I thought I was going to lose everything. I thought they were going to ruin me." She swallowed hard, the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I didn't know who to trust." "You trusted yourself," Ethan replied quietly. "That's what matters." For the first time in weeks, Emma felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The fear that had gripped her heart was slowly being replaced by something else, a feeling of empowerment. She had faced down corruption, and she had emerged stronger for it. But there was one thing still gnawing at her. One thing that still didn't make sense. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper.
How did you know what was happening?
Ethan gave her a long look, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he sighed, his shoulders relaxing, as if the burden of the truth had finally been lifted. "I suspected for a while," he said. "When I saw how some of the staff were behaving, I knew something was off. I couldn't prove it until I had solid evidence." Emma's eyes widened.
"So, you've been watching them?"
Ethan nodded. "I've been watching, yes. But I also knew that if I made my move too soon, it would alert them. They had too many connections, too much power, so I waited. I wanted to catch them in the act, with undeniable proof." She was stunned. Ethan had known everything from the beginning. The thought that he had been silently observing her, protecting her in his own way, gave her a sense of relief and appreciation she hadn't expected. He had seen her as more than just an employee. He had seen her as a person, someone worth protecting. "Thank you," Emma said, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Ethan smiled again, his gaze softening. "I didn't do it alone," he replied. "You were the one who spoke up, who kept going even when everything seemed stacked against you. That took courage." Emma looked down, her heart swelling with gratitude. "But I couldn't have done it without you. You've been there for me in ways I didn't even realize." There was a brief, silent moment between them, a connection that was felt but unspoken. And then, as if the moment were over, Ethan clapped his hands together, his tone shifting to something lighter. "Now, you've got a long road ahead of you. We've got a lot of work to do to clean up the hotel, but the first step is done. We've taken down the ones who were causing the most harm." Emma nodded, her chest tightening with the weight of everything that had happened. The world around her felt different now. The world around her felt different now. The hotel, which had once felt like a prison, now seemed like a place where justice might prevail. And maybe, just maybe, she could make a real difference here. "Are you ready to finish what you started?" Ethan asked, his voice bringing her back to the present. Emma took a deep breath, her nerves finally settling. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady. "I'm ready." As they walked out of the room, Emma felt a sense of purpose she had never felt before. The fight wasn't over yet, but the worst part was behind her. The truth was out, and now it was time for the hotel. And for Emma to heal. But even as the immediate threat was dealt with, Emma knew that the shadows of the past would linger. There were still people out there, connected to the operation, who might come after her. But she wasn't afraid anymore. Not with Ethan by her side, and not with the courage she had found within herself. The Grand Belmont Hotel was about to undergo a transformation, and Emma was ready to be part of it. This was her chance to finally prove that she was more than just another housekeeper. She was a force to be reckoned with. And nothing, not Greg, not Madeline, and certainly not Jim, could stop her now. Emma's life felt like it was spinning out of control, but there was no turning back now. After the explosive revelations at the Grand Belmont Hotel, the world around her seemed to shift. She had been thrust into a new reality, one where she was no longer just a simple housekeeper, but a key player in the fight for justice. But as much as she wanted to focus on the positive, she couldn't ignore the lingering sense of danger. She had seen enough to know that the corruption within the hotel didn't end with Greg, Madeline, or Jim. There were still pieces of the puzzle left unsolved, and Emma knew she couldn't rest until everything was exposed. One evening, just days after the arrests, Emma was on her break, sitting in the small food court just outside the staff lounge. She was eating in silence, her mind running a million miles a minute, when she noticed something unsettling. A black car pulled up just outside, and her stomach dropped when she saw who stepped out. Trina, one of the junior housekeepers who had always kept a low profile. But there was something about her demeanor that caught Emma's attention. Trina wasn't alone. She was walking briskly beside a man dressed in a sharp suit, someone Emma didn't recognize, but his presence alone sent a wave of unease through her. Curiosity, mixed with a gut feeling, told Emma she should follow them. She slipped out of her seat, carefully making her way toward the exit, trying not to be noticed. She kept her distance, watching as Trina and the man disappeared into the hotel's back entrance. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea what Trina was up to, but after everything she had seen, she couldn't afford to ignore any lead, no matter how small. As she reached the hallway leading to the service entrance, Emma's mind raced. She had no plan, no strategy, just a burning need to uncover the truth. She had barely made it to the corner when she spotted them again. Trina and the man were speaking in hushed tones near the loading dock, hidden from the view of most staff. Emma crept closer, her footsteps light, as she strained to listen. "I told you, the hotel can't afford to slip up again," the man said, his voice low and serious. "If the heat gets turned back on us, we'll all be in trouble. We'll all be in trouble. We need to act fast." Trina nodded, her eyes darting nervously. "I know, but you don't understand. It's not just about the hotel anymore. There's more at play here. We need a plane here. And we need to make sure no one talks." Emma's heart raced. There was something about their conversation that made her stomach twist. She had heard enough to understand that whatever Trina was involved in, it was far from innocent. But before she could move closer for a better look, a sudden noise behind her made her freeze. Someone was coming down the hall. Quickly, Emma ducked into a nearby storage closet, holding her breath as footsteps approached. She pressed herself against the wall, hoping the shadows would hide her. As she waited, her mind raced. She had heard enough to know that Trina was mixed up in something dangerous, something even bigger than the corruption she had uncovered so far. But who was the man with her? What was their plan? Emma's gut told her they were up to no good, and she couldn't just let it go. When the footsteps finally faded, Emma slowly emerged from the closet, her heart still pounding. She didn't know what to do next, but she knew she couldn't let Trina slip through her fingers. She had to find out more, and she had to do it quickly. She glanced around the corner and saw Trina heading back toward the elevator. The man had disappeared, likely leaving the hotel through another exit. Emma followed at a distance, determined to find out just how deep the rabbit hole went. Later that night, when Emma returned to her locker room, she found herself face to face with Trina. The younger woman was applying heavy makeup, more than usual, and her eyes were red, as if she had been crying. Emma hesitated, but then she stepped forward. "Trina," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I saw you earlier. You were talking to someone. What's going on?" Trina's eyes widened for a moment, and Emma could see the flicker of fear in her gaze, before she quickly masked it with a fake smile. "What are you talking about? I don't know what you mean." "Don't lie," Emma pressed. "I heard you. You were talking about the hotel and making sure no one talks." Her voice hardened. "What are you really involved in, Trina?" Trina hesitated, her eyes darting around the room, as if she was looking for an escape. For a split second, Emma thought she might run, but then Trina sighed, lowering her head. "You don't understand, Emma," Trina muttered. "I was just doing what I had to do. I never wanted any of this. But now I can't get out." Emma's heart sank. She had known something was off, but hearing the despair in Trina's voice made her realize how deep the hotel's problems really went. There were more people involved than she could have ever imagined, and the fight for justice was only just beginning. "I need your help," Emma said quietly, taking a step closer. "Tell me what's really going on. We can stop this together." Trina looked at her for a long moment, the weight of the decision heavy in her eyes. Finally, she nodded, but there was a look of fear there that Emma couldn't ignore. Trina was trapped, just like Emma had been, but the difference was that Emma was determined to fight, and now it seemed like Trina was ready to do the same. The pieces were falling into place, and Emma knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. What she had uncovered was only the surface, but she was ready to dig deeper, no matter where it led. The hotel's dark secrets were not going to stay buried for much longer, and this time, Emma wasn't going to let anyone stop her from finding the truth. The days after Emma's discovery of the deeper corruption within the Grand Belmont Hotel seemed to blur together. She had a new resolve now, but the tension never fully left her. Every corner of the hotel felt like it held a secret, and every conversation seemed laden with unspoken truths. But Emma was no longer afraid. She had made a promise to herself to fight, and now she was determined to see it through. It was a Thursday evening when everything took a turn for the worse. Emma had stayed late to help clean up after a particularly high-profile event that had taken place in one of the hotel's grand ballrooms. Exhausted, she grabbed her bag and began heading to the staff exit when she heard a noise behind her. She turned around quickly, but saw nothing. Her heart was still pounding from the unexpected noise when she heard it again, this time louder and more deliberate. Footsteps. She paused, her instincts kicking in as she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The hallways were empty, the lights dim, and the quiet hum of the hotel seemed to amplify the sound. Before she could react, a hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing her by the wrist and pulling her into a dark corner of the hotel. Emma's breath hitched in her throat, and for a split second, panic gripped her heart. She fought against the sudden assault, but the grip was unyielding, like iron. She didn't scream, not out of fear, but out of instinct. Her mind raced, trying to process the situation, to figure out what was happening. "Quiet," a low voice commanded. "If you don't want your life to get worse, you'll stay calm." Emma's heart skipped a beat. The voice was familiar. Jesse. Emma's thoughts flashed to their previous encounters. All the times Jesse had mocked her, belittled her, and even tried to slap her. Emma had never been one to back down, but she had never been in a situation like this before. "I've had enough of you, Emma," Jesse hissed, her grip tightening as she shoved Emma against the wall. "You think you can just waltz in here and ruin everything. You've been a thorn in my side since the moment you got hired. I'm done being nice." Emma's mind raced. She knew Jesse was trouble, but she never imagined things would escalate to this. "You can't scare me," Emma said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through her veins. "I'm not afraid of you." Jesse let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, you should be. You don't know what's going on, do you? How far this thing really goes. It's not just about the hotel anymore, Emma. It's about power. It's about power. It's about control. And people like you, you're nothing more than pawns in a much bigger game." Emma's mind spun. She had known things were bad at the Grand Belmont, but this was something else. This was deeper, darker, and far more dangerous than she could have imagined. "You're wrong," Emma said, her voice rising. "I'm not a pawn." Jesse's eyes narrowed, her smile twisting into something cruel. Without warning, she slammed Emma into the wall again, her anger boiling over. But just as Emma thought things were about to take a darker turn, a new voice pierced the tension, and the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Jesse froze, her face turning pale as the sound of approaching security grew louder. The next thing Emma knew, she was released, and Jessie had disappeared into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as she had appeared. Emma stood there for a moment, her heart pounding, but no one else came to check on her. No one else came to help. For a moment, she felt alone, but then the realization hit her. Jessie had been threatening her. But more than that, Jessie had been trying to keep her quiet, trying to protect something that was bigger than Emma could understand. This wasn't just about personal grudges or petty jealousy. This was something far more serious. Emma hurried back to the staff room, her pulse still racing. She found herself alone, unsure of what to do next. She thought about her grandmother, about everything that had led her to this moment. She thought about Richard, the kind old man who had been the key to uncovering the truth. She thought about the people who had tried to stop her, but none of them had succeeded. But Jessie's warning stuck with her. It's not just about the hotel anymore. What did that mean? What was Jessie really trying to protect? In the days that followed, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was only beginning. She knew she had to stay vigilant, but she also knew that she couldn't fight this alone. She had to take action. She had to find out everything. It wasn't just about saving herself anymore. It was about taking down the entire operation, starting with the people who had already tried to silence her. Late one night, as she sat in the staff room staring at her phone, Emma received a cryptic message that sent a chill down her spine. "You're not the only one watching." Her heart raced, but this time she wasn't afraid. Whatever was coming, Emma was ready to face it. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Emma's world had turned upside down in the past few weeks. The hotel that had once felt like a cage was now a battleground, a place where hidden truths came to light and secrets had begun to unravel. After everything she had discovered, the corruption, the lies, the power struggles, Emma knew she could never go back to being just another housekeeper. She had witnessed the dark underbelly of the Grand Belmont Hotel, and she could no longer pretend to be unaware. Every corner of the hotel now felt like a place of danger, where someone was always watching, always waiting for the right moment to strike. But even as the weight of everything pressed down on her, she couldn't shake the feeling that the most important piece of the puzzle was still missing. There was something, or rather, someone, who held the key to it all: Richard. She had learned more about him in the last few days than she ever thought possible. The old man who had seemed so humble and inconspicuous was, in fact, the owner of the hotel. It was a revelation that shook her to the core. How could someone like him, someone so quiet and unassuming, have managed to stay hidden for so long? One afternoon, after the dust had settled and most of the hotel staff had been reprimanded or fired, Emma found herself standing outside the hotel's grand office, unsure of what to expect. She had been summoned by Ethan, the head manager, who had turned out to be her unexpected ally in this fight. Ethan had always been kind to her, but lately there was something different about him. Something almost protective. He had helped her more times than she could count, and she knew that if anyone had the power to take down the corruption, it was him. But she also knew that the truth about the Grand Belmont was bigger than anything they had yet to uncover. She took a deep breath and knocked on the door. "Come in, Emma." Ethan's voice came from inside, calm and inviting. She opened the door slowly, stepping into the dimly lit room. Ethan was sitting behind his desk, the usual calmness in his demeanor replaced with a rare seriousness. There was a strange energy in the air, one that told Emma this wasn't going to be just another routine meeting. As she sat across from him, she could sense that the conversation was about to take a different turn. "Emma," Ethan began, his gaze steady, "I'm sure you're wondering why I called you in here today." Emma nodded, her heart beating faster than usual. "I think I know." Ethan leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Yes. And no. He hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I've known Richard for years, longer than you might think. He's not just the owner of the Grand Belmont. He's been playing a much bigger game than anyone realized. Emma's eyes widened. What do you mean? How could someone like him, someone who's always been so humble, be involved in something this big? Ethan looked at her with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Richard didn't want anyone to know who he really was. He knew that if people found out the truth, it would change everything. The corruption in this hotel. It wasn't just about money or power. It was about control. And Richard, for all his kindness, has had to make difficult choices to protect this place. Emma sat there, absorbing everything Ethan was saying, but a part of her still couldn't understand. Richard had been so kind to her, so gentle, so real. How could someone like him be tied up in this mess? Richard saw what was happening here, Ethan continued, but he didn't want to confront it directly. He chose to stay under the radar, to observe, to give people a chance to correct themselves before he revealed his true identity. Emma felt a pang of guilt. Had she misjudged him? Had she thought he was just an old man who didn't know what was happening around him? She had helped him without knowing who he really was, and now it seemed like she had been a part of something much bigger than she could have imagined. So, where does that leave us? Emma asked, her voice trembling slightly. What happens now? Ethan stood up, walking over to the window and gazing out at the skyline. Now, we take action. Richard has been waiting for the right moment to reveal himself. He knew the hotel was in trouble, and he knew that there were people who couldn't be trusted. But the time has come for him to act. We've exposed enough of the corruption to get things moving, but we need to be careful. There are still people out there who won't go down without a fight. Emma's mind raced. She could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. She'd always tried to stay in the background, to do her job and keep her head down. But now, she was in the middle of something much larger. The fight for justice was personal now, and there was no turning back. "What's our next move?" she asked, her voice firm. Ethan turned to face her, his expression resolute. "We gather the evidence. We expose everyone who's been involved. And we do it together. Because there's no way we can do this alone." Emma's heart swelled with a sense of purpose. She wasn't alone anymore. She had allies, people who cared about doing what was right. And for the first time since she started at the Grand Belmont, she felt like she could finally make a difference. "This is it," she said quietly. "Let's finish this." And, with that, the game had changed. The fight for the soul of the Grand Belmont Hotel had begun in earnest. But Emma was ready. Whatever came next, she was prepared to face it. Head. The truth had come to light, and there was no stopping her now. The tension in the Grand Belmont Hotel had never been thicker. Emma could feel it in the air. Heavy and suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. After the explosive revelations about the hotel's corruption, Emma had hoped for a brief reprieve, some time to catch her breath. But instead, the danger was escalating. She had barely managed to keep her head above water, constantly watching her back, never knowing who might betray her next. The lies and deceit had infected every corner of the hotel, and it seemed like there was no escaping the grip of those in power. It was during one of her late shifts, long after the last guest had checked out, that the situation took a dark turn. Emma had been assigned to clean the high-end suites on the top floor, an area usually reserved for the hotel's wealthiest clients. She had seen it all, the luxury, the grandeur, the opulence. But tonight something was different. something was different. The halls were empty, the only sound her footsteps echoing off the marble floors. As she passed room 1203, she noticed something out of the ordinary. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for her to hear muffled voices inside. Her instincts kicked in. Emma paused, her heart racing. There was something about this situation that didn't sit right with her. Quietly, she moved closer, trying to make out the words. The conversation was hushed, but she could hear enough to make her stomach twist with unease. "You think she's gonna crack?" It was Greg's voice, the hotel's corrupt floor manager. He was speaking to someone Emma didn't recognize, but his tone was laced with venom, a cold edge that sent chills down her spine. "I don't know," a second voice replied, low and conspiratorial. "She's too close to the truth. If she keeps digging, we'll have a problem." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "They're talking about me." Her mind raced. She couldn't risk being caught, overhearing this conversation. She quickly backed away, retreating to the nearby staircase and hiding in the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know exactly what they were planning, but one thing was clear. They knew she was onto them. The thought of being exposed, of losing everything she had fought so hard for, made her stomach churn. But there was no going back now. If they thought they could scare her off, they were wrong. She had come too far to turn around. The next day, Emma could barely focus on her work. She moved through the motions mechanically, her mind racing with thoughts of what she had overheard. It was no longer about her job or the petty squabbles with her coworkers. The stakes had been raised. Greg and the others were getting desperate, and the only way to beat them was to act first. That night, after her shift ended, Emma found herself standing in front of the hotel's security office. She knew she couldn't do this alone anymore. She needed help. She needed help. She'd gathered enough evidence, pieces of the puzzle. But now it was time to make her move. As she knocked on the door, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was about to come. Inside, Ethan Blake looked up from his desk, his expression softening when he saw her. "Emma," he said, his voice warm but tinged with concern. "What's going on? You don't usually stay late like this." "I heard something," Emma said, her voice steady despite the panic bubbling inside her. "Something that could change everything." Ethan raised an eyebrow.
What are you talking about?
Emma stepped forward, her eyes locking with his. "Greg, Madeline. They're planning something. They know I'm onto them, and they're going to make sure I don't get any further. They've been talking about how to silence me." Ethan's eyes darkened. "What exactly did they say?" Emma recounted the conversation she had overheard, describing every detail, every word. When she finished, Ethan stood up, pacing the small office as if trying to process everything. "This isn't just about us anymore," he said quietly. "This goes beyond the hotel. If they're willing to go this far, we need to act fast." He paused, his eyes meeting Emma's once again, this time with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "We're going to bring them down, but we can't do it alone. We need to be careful." Emma nodded, feeling a surge of determination flood through her. Ethan smiled, a rare, confident grin. "We exposed them. All of them." The plan was set into motion immediately. Emma and Ethan worked together, gathering the final pieces of the puzzle, preparing everything for the inevitable confrontation. As they dug deeper, they uncovered more than they ever expected. The corruption within the hotel was far more extensive than they could have imagined. The money laundering, the illegal deals, the ties to organized crime. It all traced back to people they never thought they'd be up against. With everything in place, the time for action came. They had no choice but to confront the enemy head on. It was going to be a battle, and they couldn't afford to lose. Emma knew that this was the final showdown. The fight for the Grand Belmont had reached its climax, and there was no turning back now. As the first step in their plan was set into motion, Emma felt a mixture of fear and excitement. She was ready to face whatever came next. The truth was out, and the only thing left to do was to take down the people who had turned her world upside down. The pieces were in place. The fight for justice was finally here. And Emma was ready to win. The storm had finally arrived. Emma stood at the heart of it, her nerves taut with anticipation. Everything had led to this moment. The weeks of gathering evidence, the careful steps of unraveling the corrupt network within the Grand Belmont Hotel, the secret meetings with Ethan, and the painful realization that the people she had once called colleagues had turned out to be her enemies. Now, there was no more running, no more hiding. The final confrontation was at hand, and Emma was ready to face whatever came next. The hotel was bustling as usual. Guests checked in, employees scrambled to keep the illusion of perfection intact. But behind the scenes, a storm was brewing. The tension among the management was palpable, especially after Emma had reported everything to Ethan. The corrupt staff, the ones involved in shady dealings, had no idea that their empire was about to crumble. They had grown comfortable, too comfortable, believing their secrets would never be uncovered. But that was about to change. Emma had spent hours preparing for this moment. She had all the evidence she needed, recordings, photos, and testimonies. The documents and files detailing the extent of the corruption were hidden in plain sight, ready to be presented. As she walked through the hotel's grand corridors, she felt a sense of determination like never before. This wasn't just about exposing the bad guys. It was about saving herself, saving the hotel from further decay and ensuring that no one else would fall victim to the poisonous atmosphere that had taken root. She headed toward the hotel's administrative offices, where Ethan had set up a meeting with the higher-ups. They were ready to make their move. Everything had been planned to the smallest detail, but Emma could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing on her shoulders. She wasn't just delivering a report. She was delivering justice. She couldn't afford to hesitate. As she reached the door to the conference room, she took one last breath, steadying herself. The moment she entered, Ethan stood at the head of the table, a calm but determined expression on his face. The rest of the senior staff were seated around him, their eyes narrowing when they saw Emma. The tension was thick enough to slice with a knife. "Let's begin," Ethan said, his voice unwavering. "We all know why we're here today." Emma could see the unease ripple through the room, especially among Greg and Madeline. They had been expecting this, but not like this. Ethan's tone was all business, but there was an edge to it that made them uneasy. He had spent weeks laying the groundwork, ensuring everything was in place before making his move. He turned to Emma, signaling for her to begin. Emma stepped forward, her hands shaking slightly, but she quickly regained control. The room fell silent as she spoke, her voice steady and clear. She began with the details of the corruption she had uncovered, carefully laying out the evidence piece by piece. She didn't spare anyone, naming names, describing events, and showing the photos and recordings that proved their involvement. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, some defensive, others guilty, but none of them daring to speak. As she continued, she could see the panic building in Greg and Madeline's eyes. They had thought they were untouchable, that their power and influence would protect them. But Emma had no intention of letting them get away with it. She finished her presentation, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Ethan turned to the room, his voice cutting through the silence. "This is the reality of what's been happening under your noses. The Grand Belmont is more than just a luxury hotel. It's been a hub for illegal activity, and it's time to end it." Greg stood up abruptly, his face red with fury. "This is ridiculous. You don't know what you're talking about." Madeline quickly followed suit. "You can't do this. We built this hotel into something great, and now you're trying to tear it down with these lies." But Ethan's expression never faltered. "No, Greg. You tore it down. You and your people, with your greed and corruption. You've taken advantage of this place, and now it's time to pay for your actions." A heavy silence followed, but it wasn't the end. The police were already on their way, and Emma had made sure all the right people were in place to arrest them. The evidence had been sent ahead, and the hotel's most powerful people were about to face the consequences of their actions. "Greg, Madeline, you're both under arrest for corruption, illegal activity, and conspiracy." A voice rang out from the door. Two police officers entered, their presence filling the room with finality. The two managers froze, their faces drained of color as they realized the truth. The game was over. They had no way out. The evidence was irrefutable. They were going to be taken down, and the Grand Belmont was going to be free of the poison they had injected into it. As the officers led Greg and Madeline away, Emma stood there, her heart pounding, but her spirits soaring. She had done it. She had brought them down. The corrupt empire that had ruled the hotel for so long had crumbled, and with it, Emma felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Ethan stepped up to her, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You did great, Emma. You've changed everything." Emma smiled back, the exhaustion of the past few weeks finally catching up with her. "It's not over yet," she said quietly, her eyes looking toward the future. "But it's a start. A good start." And for the first time since she had started working at the Grand Belmont, Emma felt like she was truly in control of her destiny. The fight wasn't over, but the battle had been won. She had faced the darkness head-on, and now she could finally look ahead to a future that was hers to shape. The day had come. After everything, the lies, the betrayals, the sleepless nights spent fearing for her future, Emma was finally standing at the threshold of the Grand Belmont Hotel as the woman who had taken down the empire of corruption that had plagued the hotel for so long. The weight of the victory felt surreal, almost impossible. She had fought for this, bled for this, and now the hotel was hers to help rebuild, a place that would never again be a den of deceit and exploitation. But as she stood there looking up at the shining windows, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the true journey was only just beginning. The last few weeks had been a blur of revelations. The corrupt managers, the illegal dealings, the shady operations running right under their noses, all exposed. And at the center of it all was Emma, the unlikely hero who had fought not only for justice, but for the future of the hotel she had come to love. But amid the chaos, one question had remained unanswered. It was the question that gnawed at her most nights, the question that had kept her awake. What happens now? She had done the impossible. She had taken down the people who had turned the hotel into a place of greed and manipulation. The law had been on her side, and Richard, the elusive owner, had made sure that justice would be served. The higher-ups had been arrested, and the crooked staff had been fired. But the hotel's future remained uncertain. Emma knew that tearing down the old system wasn't enough. Rebuilding would take time, patience, and above all, the courage to face whatever new challenges might arise. The phone in her pocket buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Ethan. "Meet me in the office. There's something we need to discuss." Emma's pulse quickened. She hadn't spoken to Ethan alone since everything had gone down. After the arrests, there had been nothing but paperwork and meetings, ensuring the transition was smooth. But this message was different. Something about it made her stomach tighten. She took a deep breath and headed to the administrative office, the familiar steps beneath her feet now feeling strangely heavy. The hallways, once filled with the sounds of whispered secrets and hushed deals, were eerily quiet now. The hotel felt empty in a way it hadn't before, as though it was waiting for something, waiting for something, waiting for its soul to be restored. As she entered the office, she saw Ethan sitting at the large desk, his hands folded in front of him. He looked up as she walked in, his eyes scanning her face with an unreadable expression. "Emma," he said, his voice steady, but there was an underlying tension that she hadn't expected. "I've been thinking about everything we've done, everything we've uncovered. It's not over. The hotel's not free yet." Emma frowned. "What do you mean?" "We've exposed everything. The police have the evidence, and the corrupt managers are in custody. This place is turning a new page." Ethan leaned forward, his gaze intense. "It's not that simple. We've taken down the obvious players, but there are still people, still forces at work, pulling strings behind the scenes. People who have money, power, and the kind of influence that doesn't just disappear overnight. This hotel is part of something much bigger, and we're not done yet." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She had suspected it, but hearing Ethan say it out loud sent a shiver through her. The thought that the Grand Belmont was still under the shadow of something even darker was terrifying. They hadn't just defeated a few corrupt managers. They had uncovered the tip of an iceberg, and the real danger was still beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan stood up and walked over to the window, his back to her for a moment. He stared out over the city, the lights of New York flickering beneath them. Finally, he spoke, his words heavy with finality. "We fight. We keep pushing. We rebuild this place the right way, but we do it carefully. The people who want to keep this hotel under their control will stop at nothing to protect their interests. But we can't back down. We can't let them win." Emma swallowed hard. She had thought the battle was over, but it was just the beginning. The hotel was still theirs to protect, still theirs to reclaim from the forces that threatened to destroy it. And it was her responsibility now, her burden to bear. Ethan turned to face her, his expression softening for the first time since the conversation began. "I know this is a lot, but I believe in you, Emma. You've proven that you have the strength to see this through. You've already done the impossible." For a moment, Emma didn't speak. She just stared at Ethan, the weight of his words sinking in. She had come this far, and she couldn't stop now. The fight had only just begun, and it was a fight she was ready for. With a nod, she straightened her back, feeling a sense of resolve she hadn't realized she had. Together. And so, Emma and Ethan stood side by side, knowing that the future of the Grand Belmont Hotel lay in their hands. The shadows that had plagued the hotel for so long hadn't disappeared, but Emma was ready to face them head. Whatever came next, she would stand tall. The battle was far from over, but Emma was determined to see it through to the end. The hotel would be restored, rebuilt, and protected from the darkness that had once threatened to consume it. She wouldn't stop until it was. Emma stood at the window of her office, gazing out at the city that sprawled beneath her. The lights of New York flickered like stars scattered across the vast expanse, a reminder of the vastness of the world outside. But as she stared at the horizon, Emma felt a strange sense of calm. After everything, the betrayals, the deception, the sleepless nights, it was finally over. Or so she thought. The Grand Belmont Hotel had undergone a transformation. No longer was it a symbol of greed, corruption, and shadowy dealings. The hotel was a beacon of integrity, slowly but surely shedding the layers of filth that had built up over the years. She had been a part of this monumental change. But Emma knew that even though the criminals had been removed, the real work of restoring the hotel to its rightful place had only just begun. The damage done by the previous administration ran deep, and undoing it would take time. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. She turned around to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his ever-present calm expression tempered with a hint of concern. "You've been staring out that window for a while," he said softly, stepping inside. "You... okay?" Emma smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. She was physically exhausted, but her mind was restless, constantly ticking over every detail of what had happened. "Yeah, just thinking, it's hard to believe everything is finally coming together." Ethan crossed the room, leaning against the desk as he glanced out the window beside her. "It's been a long road, but you've done it, Emma. You're the reason this hotel isn't in the hands of those who would destroy it." She nodded but couldn't shake the weight in her chest. It wasn't just about the hotel anymore. It wasn't even just about the corruption being exposed. It was about the toll it had taken on her. She had been a pawn in the game for so long, unaware of the true forces at play. And now she was expected to lead. It felt overwhelming at times. "Ethan, I don't know if I'm ready for this," she admitted, her voice quiet. Everything changed so quickly. One minute I was just doing my job, and now I'm supposed to take over this place. What if I fail? What if I can't keep it from falling back into the same traps? Ethan smiled, a reassuring, almost fatherly smile. "You won't fail. You've already proven yourself time and time again. You've faced things no one should ever have to face, and yet you've come out stronger. This hotel needs someone like you, someone who won't stand for the lies, who's willing to fight for what's right." Emma looked at him, unsure. The weight of the responsibility was suffocating, but she knew he was right. She had come this far, and backing out now wasn't an option. She had faced down people who were willing to do anything to maintain control. She had seen the darkness that lurked behind the Grand Belmont's glossy facade, and she had survived it. She could do this. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Ethan's eyes softened. "You're not alone, Emma, and you won't be. We'll do this together." With his words, Emma felt a flicker of hope ignite in her chest. She wasn't alone. She had allies now. Real, trustworthy allies. For the first time in months, she felt like she had control over her own future. The fight for the Grand Belmont wasn't over, but she was no longer a passive player in someone else's game. She was the one making the decisions now. "Do you think we can really fix this place?" she asked, more to herself than to Ethan. "I think we can," he replied, his voice steady and filled with belief. "But it's going to take time, patience, and hard work. People will test you. They'll try to bring you down. But you have something they don't. You have the truth on your side, and that's more powerful than anything else." Emma took a deep breath, a sense of determination settling in her chest. She was ready to fight, ready to rebuild, and ready to lead the Grand Belmont into a new era. There were challenges ahead, no doubt about that. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had faced the darkness and come out the other side. And now, she was the light that would guide the hotel back to the right path. With a final glance out the window at the sprawling city below, Emma made her decision. The Grand Belmont would be hers to protect, to nurture, and to rebuild. The fight was far from over, but it was one she was finally prepared to win. She wasn't just a housekeeper anymore. She was the heart of this hotel. And as long as she was here, nothing would ever threaten it again. The story of Emma and her journey through the dark corridors of corruption within the Grand Belmont Hotel teaches us some profound lessons. First and foremost, it emphasizes the power of perseverance. Emma started as an ordinary housekeeper, simply trying to survive in a world where those with power controlled everything. Yet, through her tenacity, courage, and unwavering belief in doing what was right, she brought down an empire of lies and corruption. This story reminds us that no matter where we start in life, with enough determination and heart, we have the power to make a difference. Moreover, the importance of integrity shines through. Emma's refusal to compromise her values, even when surrounded by deceit, was what ultimately allowed her to triumph. In a world where shortcuts and corruption often seem like the easy route, standing by your principles is more powerful than anything. It's a reminder that, while the road may be tough and the battle's hard, maintaining integrity will always be your greatest strength. Lastly, the story highlights the importance of allies. Emma didn't win this battle alone. She had the support of key people who believed in her. Finding the right people to trust and lean on, especially when facing overwhelming odds, can be the difference between success and failure. Now, we'd love to know where you're watching from. And if you enjoyed Emma's journey, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Your support helps us keep bringing you the content you love.